Hi, everybody. Welcome to this adult science fiction fantasy debut panel, fall edition, because I feel like since it's September, it is officially fall. I know we're at the end of September, but still, it is September. And so obviously, we are full on fall mode. Um, it's funny because obviously, I title them adult science fiction fantasy versus the YA science fiction fantasy, but Linktree has recently been like, I think that this might be sensitive material because it says adult science fiction fantasy debut panel. I was like, oh, okay, maybe I should like rename the next one so it doesn't immediately get flagged. I honestly never thought of that, but it's clear that there's like no reading context in those bots that are just scanning the title. But anyway, I'm really excited to be here. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily, and I'm the moderator for the panel and like a persona, I guess, behind Utopia's State of Mind. We're going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump straight into questions that I have. If you have any questions, though, at any time during the chat, you can put them in the live chat box, I guess, and I will try to go back to them at the end. And yeah, we'll just have Nancy start off with the author intros.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this, and thank you to everybody for being here. So I'm the author. My debut novel is called A Sea of Spectres, and you can see here I have all my tags. It's my reading copy for when I do book events. So I'll just read you the log line for it. On the choppy coastline of Prince Edward Island, an ocean-phobic detective evades the deadly lure of a phantom ship by delving into her family's history and harnessing her matrilineal powers of premonition. And this search takes her back into two different timelines, two more timelines, 1864 Charlottetown and 1758 Charlottetown. So it's classified, I wrote it as a historical fiction fantasy, but it's actually classified as a mystery. So it crosses a lot of genres. And I'm really excited today to talk more about the speculative elements. Thanks.
All right. Guess I'm next. Yeah, super excited to be here. Thanks for having me. My name's Hannah Lee. I'm a speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy writer living in California. I have two cats. They're really important to me. They're locked out of the room right now, so you won't see them, unfortunately. I really love, I guess, movies, video games, RPGs, like all kinds of nerdy stuff. And the stuff that I write tends to be heavily influenced by like video games or pop culture in some way. And my debut novel is no exception. I wasn't prepared enough to bring a physical copy into this room like Nancy did. That was really smart. But I can also read my logline off my publisher's website. Road to Ruin is an electrifying, gritty fantasy from debut author Hannah Lee that takes a royal messenger on a high-speed chase across a climate-ravaged wasteland featuring motorcycles, monsters, and magic. And what that description doesn't mention is two important things. One, the novel is heavily inspired by the movie Mad Max Fury Road, which is my favorite movie. And two, it's really gay. There are three main characters who are all in love with each other. And like, there's no way to do that isn't gay. Like, you can kind of see how that works. Yeah, pass it off to Jules.
Cool. I'm Jules Arbo. I am the author of Lord of the Empty Isles, which I actually remembered to grab before I got super pretty edition, which is about a boy who wants to death curse the outlaw who killed his brother, but when he does so, he discovers that he is fate-bound to that outlaw and will die along with him unless he figures out a solution. And so that's what that's about.
Okay, my first question, which is completely unscripted, but I would love to know what a log line is.
Do any of us know?
It's where you take 80 to 100,000 words and you cram it all into one sentence.
Oh, okay.
This is what my book is about. It's your elevator pitch. It's actually a shortened version of your elevator pitch, I think.
And if you're lucky, your publisher writes it for you. That's
exactly
what they did to me.
There are a lot of commas in it. and then...
Yeah. Okay, perfect. That's what I figured. But then I've never heard it like referred to as such. So then I was wondering, like, is this an abbreviation? Is there like a longer sort of secret meaning behind it? Yeah, I finished Road to Ruin and I immediately like watched probably 2 hours of Mad Max Fury Road compilations. I of course didn't just watch Mad Max Fury Road. I instead watched like the 10 best scenes from Mad Max Fury Road to bring back the nostalgia.
But you have
Because for
seen the
some
actual
reason,
movie, right?
yeah, I've seen the movie, but for some
Oh,
reason I was like, oh, I don't have time to watch the whole movie. So I'll just watch like 1 or 2 YouTube videos of my favorite scenes or my favorite
Mhm.
character moments. And then it was like 2 hours later and I was like, well, now I really want to watch the movie. So it saved no time. Um,
Mhm.
I want to know, I guess the segue for that is that I want to know also about the inspiration for the book, for all of your books, as well as kind of the general experience of debuting within the speculative fiction genre. And Hannah, do you want to start? Because I feel like we just talked so much about Mad Max Fury Road.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was really relieved to hear that you saw the movie and weren't introduced to it through compilations. Like that was horrifying to me existentially. um, like no shame to anybody who does that. A little bit of shame. Um, but yeah, my book is really heavily inspired by my favorite movie. The idea for the book was like slowly percolating in my head for years after I saw it in theaters. But it's also like a mishmash of my inspirations from different mediums as well. Like the TV show Legend of Korra, the video game Final Fantasy VII, like in my brain, they just all kind of get mixed together and various elements of world building are taken out and smushed together. So yeah, that's the inspiration. As far as what it was like to debut in this genre, it was, I mean, I can't compare it to debuting in any other genre because I haven't done that. But it was fun. It was exciting. It felt like a very small world. There aren't a lot of speculative fiction authors who debut each year. So you kind of get to know, or at least are aware of, pretty much everybody else. And it's pretty cool because like we're very supportive of each other. Like we go to each other's events and things. If you're lucky enough to live in an area where multiple people are debuting in the same genre, which I realize not everyone is, but like I live in a pretty densely populated area with a lot of writers. So I was lucky enough to get to go to other book launches and have those authors come to mine. And it created like a nice little community. Somebody else want to hop in?
I guess I can go next. My book wasn't actually meant to be science fantasy or space fantasy in the early brainstorming stages. But I was doing some what if brainstorming when the concept was at its like earliest level. And originally it was really more of an actual like seafaring pirates idea. And then I was like, nah. And so I asked myself, like, what if the Isles are pseudomoons instead? And so that kicked off like an hour-long brainstorming flood. Even though I knew I shouldn't go for science fantasy again because I had queried a science fantasy and it had, it wasn't a great experience. And I'd been burned. So I was like, I really shouldn't do this. And I was like, I want to do this. And so I did. For debuting, I think my experience was a bit of an unusual one. Because I didn't have a book launch. My book sold at auction in the UK, but did not find a publishing home in the US because it was kind of weird and genre blendy and risky. And so it sold in the UK.
Nice. It's interesting that Jules says she originally didn't start out with that speculative element because I'm sort of the same way. And because my book is 3 different timelines, it was inspired by 3 different things. One was an article about my ancestor 11 generations ago, Madeleine Doiron, who was caught up in the Acadian expulsion. So that's when the Acadians during the 7 Years' War were taken from what's now the Maritimes in Canada and sent to France and different places around the world. And so I was really interested in her because my mother had sent me an article about her family, but it was all about the husband. And it was how the husband needed a wife for his 2 young children. So he married Madeleine, who was 15 years old at the time. He was 30. And that she went on to have 15 children by him. And I know all the women I talk to say this, their eyes go, oh my God, I just can't imagine. And then it says, and she went on to have a very good life. And I thought, clearly her life was much more complicated and interesting than that. So I was really interested in her. And then I was looking at another timeline in 1864, and I found an almanac that was put out by the Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island archives about 1864. And there was a note in there about a bank cleaner who stole banknotes and then counterfeited signatures on them, because at the time, to be legal tender, they had to be signed. And I was really interested in that. And I was thinking, what would make her steal banknotes and what might happen after? And so that connected me to my contemporary character, who is now the police detective who goes off on this search, which is started by a search for a missing person, which takes her in a very different direction than she had thought. But I always knew I wanted the timelines to talk to each other, and I wanted the main characters to talk to each other through time and space, through premonitions or some sort of foretellings. And it took me a long time to sort of figure out how to do that and how it was going to work. And so in the end, I went with Akkadian folklore, and that's sort of my speculative spine, looking at, there's a forerunner, there's a harbinger of death, there's a phantom ship, there's a sea creature. So I put all those together, and it became such like a solid part of the spine of the novel that I couldn't then take it apart, and the speculative elements drove me forward. So that was really fun for me. And also debuting in this area, speculative fiction, whether or not it's dystopian or science fiction or fantasy of like epic or low or magical realism, there's my favorite things to read, because sort of anything can happen. So debuting in that element of something that I'm always drawn to, those types of stories, has been a lot of fun for me to sort of have my book sit on the shelves with others who've written stories with speculative elements. It was a lot of fun.
I want to pick up on something you were saying, Jules, about the premise changing and adding the science, the speculative aspects to it. So for all of you, but I want to start with Jules, how did your main characters then appear to you? Obviously as pirates, but like, how did the visions of them kind of appear? How did they change throughout drafting? And then for, it's a general question for everybody, but I want to start off with Jules here.
Okay, well, Remy himself, like my main character, the POV character, didn't change too much from his first inception. But since I only planned very loosely, I kind of ended up writing my way into discoveries about him as the story went on. But the basics were established pretty early, since I'm a quilter, which is a word I recently discovered, which means I write completely out of order. And so a lot of times I'll start with a whole bunch of pivotal scenes, like ones I know that are absolutely important to the story. And so I get to know the character through those scenes. And then finishing the book is actually a process of sewing together those pieces. And so I knew Remy pretty well from the start. But as I built out like the crew of the Astrid, it was weird, because normally one of the things I have the most trouble with is finding character names. Like, I'll have an idea of what the character is going to be like, but I have to stumble on the perfect name. But while I was brainstorming, like the last names, their histories, everything fell into place for the crew like almost immediately. And so I knew it had to be like that. And so I think there were some changes, but they were more on the plot level later on. But the characters themselves kind of stayed as they were from the start.
Yeah, I can go next, because I had, so my, sorry, just as I started, Hannah, do you want to go ahead?
No, I was motioning at you.
Okay. We're all being very polite, which is very nice of us. So my historical characters in 1758 was Madeline, and 1864 was Celeste. The characters stayed pretty much the same, because I was following history. Madeline, the first part of the book, really follows the actual genealogical demographic facts for her life. And then Celeste was based on this almanac. So it started, I always knew she was a bank cleaner. She had come from outside town. She was an outsider. And so what do outsiders do when they're in a place where they're having trouble surviving? But my contemporary character originally was someone named Raina, and she was a military officer. And I was drawing on my own military background. And I wanted to bring that aspect in. And for whatever reason, and I think it's because I hadn't really found the proper character, her character just wasn't working. So I'd written probably at least 20, 25,000 words of her story, and I dumped the entire thing because it just wasn't working. And then I went to, it was very painful, but it was very freeing. It was like the best decision I could have made, because if I'd kept those words in, they would never have been good words anyway. So then I changed her to a police detective who was scared of the ocean on an island that's this narrow 2,000 square foot island, because I thought that would be really fun. And then throw in a phantom ship that's trying to lure her into its clutches. And then use her investigative skills to start this search that leads her to a missing person, which leads them to a journal, which leads them, and then they trade off into the past. And also while I was doing this, because it took me quite a while, one of my cousins had a baby that she named Riley. So I couldn't use the name Riley for my character, which was a good thing anyway, because I needed to like reconceptualize her. It's Jules mentioned names, the importance of names. So I needed a totally new name so that I could think of the character in a different way. And then she became Raina.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Jules said that they are a loose planner and they learn things about their characters along the way, but she writes things out of order, because like I very much identify with the first two statements and not at all with the third. I have to write completely in order from beginning to end. I don't know, just something forces me to be that way. But I also like figure out a lot of things about my characters along the way. Sometimes that's great because it means that the reader is kind of going along the same journey of discovery that I was when I was writing the character. Sometimes it's not, because I discover something that like really should have been hinted at earlier. Thankfully, we're allowed to edit our books before they get published. If we weren't allowed to do that, like my career would be over. But yeah, my main character, Jin, I think personality-wise, she's pretty much the same as she started out, just like a rugged loner who, well, she thinks she's a loner, but she actually needs people a lot more than she thinks she does, falls in love really easily, really hates that about herself, and has a soft spot for like things that need taking care of, like weak things, children, animals. What changed about her, I guess, was elements of her backstory. Like I would introduce characters or run into situations and be like, oh, she knows this character, or she's been in a situation like this before. How did that happen? And then have to go back and weave that in more tightly into the story.
I want to ask now my favorite question, which is who is your favorite side character and why? I feel like side characters often can be such beloved characters from readers. And so, excuse me. I want to know who is your favorite side character and why? Nancy, do you want to start?
Sure. So this was a fun question, because I have a few of them, but the one that is my favorite side character is Raina's third cousin once removed, and she's a generation younger than Raina. And I love those intergenerational relationships to write them. I never set out necessarily to write them intentionally, but I find they're a lot of fun, and the characters are complete foils to each other. So Raina is a straight-laced, serious, and sarcastic police detective. And then the third cousin once removed, I won't tell you her name because it's a bit of a spoiler, is totally exuberant, and she likes to have fun, and she pushes all of Raina's buttons, and she knows how to do it, and she does it on purpose. So it was a lot of fun to write those scenes. And she initially wasn't a character at all. She turned up and she just sort of popped into the story for me, and then turned out to be quite a central one. So I always think that's interesting when as you have this plan, because I'm pretty much of a planner, but I allowed the pantsing to take me wherever it needs to go. And so this character became quite central to the book in the end, and she was so much fun to write. I'm bringing her back actually in a sequel.
I guess I can go. Yeah, so my favorite side character, pretty hard to choose, but I think I'll go with Sozel. So, like, when the book starts, you might not think he's a side character. You might think he's the antagonist, but no, he's not that big of a deal. He's not that important. The reason I like him is because he's an asshole. Like, his views are all kinds of wrong. He's misogynistic. He's a jerk. He looks down on, like, people who are lower in society than him. He's a nobleman, and he has magical abilities. And in this society, people who have magical abilities have a higher position than people who don't. And he has two of them. So, he's an extra special boy. But he's also just so pathetic. And, like, It's great because I can like put him through the meat grinder. I can have other characters kick him around and he'll be like, no, but I'm supposed to be better than you. It's just really fun.
My favorite side character is probably the stabby, exhausted, not a doctor, Eve Radon, who was not actually meant to have as large a role as they do. But I knew for one scene in particular, I was going to need a doctor character. And the more I wrote Eve, the more I was like, oh yeah, I actually really, really love them. Because the way that their role kind of interacts with Remy's, because he's cast this curse, and now he and a whole crew of people are dying much more quickly than they expected to be. And Remy's sort of slowly realizing that maybe things are a lot more complicated than he thought they were initially. And so Eve comes in as both a doctor and, for spoilerish reasons I can't go into, someone who is also capable of killing. And so they're sort of foils for each other. And I just really love the way that their roles interacted. And so Eve ended up, like, instead of having just that one scene, they ended up in most of the book.
I want to talk about setting, and Nancy specifically for Sea of Spectres, since it is set on Earth, but also Prince Edward Island. And I've been to Prince Edward Island, so I was so excited when I saw this.
Nice.
I wanted to know if you could talk to us about infusing the supernatural with our world, and obviously our world in like a few different kind of settings, not just Earth, Prince Edward Island.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, as I mentioned earlier, this was the most fun part of it for me, particularly because Prince Edward Island has it's because it's an island, and any of you know, like smaller islands and the people that live there, it has its own really unique culture, and one that people really try to protect and see as being different from other places, but also because of the folklore is just so rich in the area. So there's ghosts, there's phantom ships, there's even more ghosts, there's legends about pirates and fairies, and so all these different cultures come together, including the Mi'kmaq, the First Nations people who were there before the settlers came, and Irish and Scottish, French, which is where my background comes from, the French Acadians. And how all that mixes together. And so when you're using historical fiction, there's certain facts that you either can't change or shouldn't change unless you're calling it an alternate history. And what I really like about writing history is there's these fascinating things that happen with women. And women they do bad things, they do good things, they do complicated things. And a lot of times their stories are not told. And so whenever I find this fact that I think to myself, I can't believe that's true, then that's the fact that I want to follow. And it often connects with folklore. And so while historical fiction in some ways gives me constraints, which is sometimes really helpful actually to scaffold a story on it, speculative fiction opens up these vast possibilities, particularly because there's so many versions of the same folklore. So there's a woman in white who's a harbinger of death. Different ways of looking at her. Is she a forerunner? Is she a grim reaper? Is it cause and effect? Or she's just someone who warns you? The phantom ship as well. A lot of ocean-going countries around the world have legends of the phantom ship. Pirates of the Caribbean, for instance, picked up phantom ship as one of those as well. But once you have those, you can bring it into your story in any way that works. And so that was a lot of fun for me, particularly with respect to the phantom ship, because so the phantom ship, the legend is, and this is a very well-known Prince Edward Island legend from the 1700s. And it was so well known that Canada Post, the National Postal Service here in Canada, actually did a stamp commemorating that phantom ship quite a few years ago. And so in the Northumberland Strait, which is in between Prince Edward Island and the mainland, there's this 3 or 4 masted schooner that is ablaze in fire with specters and ghosts cavorting all over it. And the rational people, I'm a rational person, but I also love the magical and the mystical, will say, no, it's the setting sun in the Northumberland Strait in the fall if you're looking in a certain direction. And that's what you're seeing. But however, the sightings have been so amazing and so realistic that seasoned sailors have actually changed course to go on a distress call to save the people on the ship that they think is a real ship with real people, including the Northumberland ferries that operate between the mainland and Prince Edward Island, because it's just so real to them. And then they get close, and then the flames and the specters, they just disappear into thin air. So I wanted to take that, and there's a lot of ideas about what is this, where does the legend come from? Is it from pirates? Speaking of pirates, is it from the Acadian expulsion? Is it from fishers? And what had happened? So I could take that and start to create it and figure out for myself what the mystery of the Phantom Ship might have been and how it connected to my characters, which I finished after I finished A Sea of Spectres. Then I figured out where it might have come from. So I went back, as Hannah said, and edited in hints, but readers won't find out what it is until we get into either the second or the third books. So I still have time to develop that.
I just want to remind everyone watching that if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. We have one already, but I know sometimes it takes a little bit of time to think of them, so you can drop them in whenever you want. And I want to talk about the letters in Road to Ruin, because I am a sucker for letters in like any form in books. And so I wanted to know for you what it was like to use letters as a way for characterization, but also for plot. And how did your approach to letters change from, maybe how you would approach like whatever non-letters are called, but normal non-letter texts, and if there were unexpected challenges or benefits to letters?
Yeah, for sure. So I wrote half of the book before I even put any of the letters in. I didn't know that I was going to do that. I didn't get the idea until I was having a bit of writer's block. So I decided to take a break and read some books. And I picked up This Is How You Lose the Time War, which wound up becoming one of
that book.
Yeah, it's so good.
Oh.
Nicholas Dickless was right.
I read it way before then, just for the record.
So did I.
Of course you did.
But when I saw that happen, I was like, yes, well deserved. Now everyone will know about this. But yeah, that book like changed me as a writer, as a human. Like it's still one of my favorites of all time. And it gave me the idea of these two characters, the prince and the princess in my book, who are in love with each other but don't appear on screen together until the very end of the book. Like how I was having a lot of trouble like centering that very important relationship that was like a big motivating factor for the plot. I was like, well, how do I make readers care about this if they're not interacting? So the letters just solved that problem for me. I mean, it was still kind of difficult because like most people don't fall in love through writing letters to each other. Like they meet in person and, have physical chemistry, at least in romance novels. But yeah, having them write letters to each other, like the difference between the way a character talks and the way that they express themselves in writing, it's all really fun to play with. Like the prince is not a very eloquent character in person. Like he's kind of a himbo, like a jock type guy. But when he writes, or rather when he dictates, because he doesn't write his own letters, he's a prince, he just becomes a lot more eloquent and romantic. And it's kind of a truer side of him than like the person that for many reasons he is compelled to be, like when physically interacting with people. And then the princess is interesting because there are so many layers to her. Like she's hiding stuff, she's manipulating, scheming. So as the reader, you kind of have to guess which parts of what she wrote in these letters are actually true and which parts are her trying to paint a different picture of herself than she really is. I wouldn't say that the letters really drove the plot forward much, because most of the letters included in the book happens before the events of the book. Like they kind of take you back in the timeline, but they were super important for characterization. And I'm glad that I got to leave them in and that I had the idea to put them in there in the first place.
Yeah, I think that something you were saying was why I picked up on that one, like on the letters, concept of the letters from the beginning. There's a vulnerability that you see in some of the letters, and like a way that how you talk to someone without also like a direct one-to-one response, kind of. You have so many more things that you're thinking about, and like the time frame is also different too, right? You don't necessarily get a letter and then immediately write a response and then have it immediately go out. There's time that you're not seeing that is in between these, especially since they're not like, I don't know, being poofed via email, right? Like they're being actually delivered by people.
Mhm.
I want to talk about how guilt and loss factor into Lord of the Empty Isles, since obviously the book starts off with kind of a really important loss and like the idea of revenge and following that. And I was wondering if you could talk about how it was to delve into both of those like really intensely charged emotional themes, and if your feelings on the themes and perhaps like the resolution, how your characters are navigating it, if they changed during the drafting and the writing process.
Absolutely. The themes were pretty personal for me when I was writing the book. It was, of course, written in 2020 and 2021, so all of that was happening. And I had also recently lost 2 people, and my mom's health was in a questionable place. And so writing Lord of the Empty Isles was sort of about navigating those feelings for me. But when I explore things in fiction, I think a lot of people go at it straight on, and that's really important. But for me, I tend to like abstractify things, so that I can address them, so that I can face them. And so for Remy, obviously there was, for legal reasons and realistically, there was no one that I wanted to murder. At the time when I was writing the book, I did not attempt to murder anybody, but Remy's story is about 5 years after his brother's loss. He has finally gained the last ingredient he needs to kill the person who killed his brother. And he thinks that's the right thing to do. He thinks that's the way to healing for him. And that if he can do this, he can move forward, he can feel better, he can actually heal from this loss that's been haunting him forever. And of course, he has a friend who's like, that's not how it works. But he has to actually try to murder the people, and learn, and kind of face what he's done and expand his understanding of the world before he realizes that there's a lot more going on than he knows. And I'm being vague because there are a lot of spoilers involved. But it was intense writing the book. There were some scenes, like I did write a little bit more in order than I otherwise do. Like I wrote multiple pivotal scenes, but chunks of the book were actually written in order. But I got to the 75% mark of the book, and I couldn't finish it because I knew that there were some things I was going to need to write, and I wasn't ready to write them. And so I was like, okay, cool. And I did another thing that you're definitely not supposed to do. And I stopped writing at that point. I was like, cool, I'm just going to go back. I'm going to revise the whole rest of the book up to 75%. And then I will write the ending. So I wrote a bullet pointed list of what I knew was going to happen in the ending. And then I went back and revised the whole thing, because I know that one of the writing rules is that you're not actually supposed to revise while you write. But I do regularly. It's just how my process works. So I revised the whole thing, and then when I got there, I think I did a revision for like a month and a half, and then it was the new year, and I was like, cool, I am going to caffeinate myself, and I'm going to write the entire rest of this book before the new year. And I didn't quite do that, but I did write like 12,000 words in a day and a half. So
Wow.
And so that was how I got through that.
Yeah, because in Lord of the Empty Isles, I mean, we're chatting right now about guilt and loss, but revenge as well is obviously a very big theme too. And I feel like all three of those emotions that you are navigating and exploring in your book, they all have that like a characteristic, almost like eye of the storm effect, where you're in those emotions and like you can't escape. You just become so enmeshed in those feelings. And obviously for 5 years, it takes a long time, if ever, to like get out of that sort of bubble and that out of that experience, for people and obviously characters in fiction.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to ask about the queer representation in Road to Ruin and Lord of the Empty Isles, and about, for both of you, how it is to create queer normative worlds, specifically also in the speculative fiction space. So, Hannah, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Well, in Road to Ruin, the world is actually not what I would call queer normative. I feel like queer normative worlds in speculative fiction are worlds where like every sexuality is considered equally like normal. Like there's nothing weird about preferring one thing over another. Nobody thinks of you differently. Whereas in Road to Ruin, that's not the case. Like in Road to Ruin, the civilization is split up into these isolated like city states. Every city state kind of has its own culture, and they have different views on this sort of thing. Like the place where the princess comes from, she mentions pretty early on in the book that like she's allowed to dabble with women as long as it stops when she gets married to a man. Like it's considered almost practice. Obviously, this is like a super homophobic way of treating queer relationships. Like it's not a great place for her to exist as a bisexual woman. Whereas in the other city, like where the prince lives, like it's a lot more queer normative, I would say. It's not mentioned in the first book, but it comes up in the second that like one of the leaders, a city official in a seat of power, is like married to a person of the same gender. And it's maybe seen as a little weird, but like she's still got the power, so it worked out. But yeah, I think I almost never write in completely queer normative worlds because I guess I find it interesting to play around with how different cultures that are not our own and are not even on Earth would view this type of thing. And queer normative worlds are great. They definitely have their place in speculative fiction. But I guess I like to treat it sometimes as another layer of conflict, especially in a story where all of the main characters are queer in some way. And they have a lot of barriers that prevent them from getting what they want, and some of those are societal and systemic because society doesn't treat their relationships the same way, like with the princess.
I think Lord of the Empty Isles is relatively queer normative. There are a few points in Remy's journey. He is asexual and aromantic spectrum, and he's also kind of gender nonconforming. His brother was also queer, and so there are a lot of queer characters in the book, and there are things that Remy is still coming to terms with or had to come to terms with. But what I really wanted to do when I wrote the book is that I think a lot of books because the Lord of the Empty Isles has like a magic system, like a tether system, where people are connected to each other with different tethers, and the color of the tether and the location of the tether on the body all mean different things. And I think a lot of books that deal with soul bonds, like concepts or things like that, use those to tell a story that is explicitly romantic. And I think that's amazing. I think it's important for those books to exist, but I wanted to craft a magic system specifically that not only underlined the book's themes, but like explicitly valued bonds that aren't romantic, so that no part of the tether system values one type of love over another. And so since Remy is asexual and since he's not interested at all in romantic relationships, I wanted to make sure the magic system in the world itself kind of echoed that. And I love that speculative fiction allows authors to do that. It's important, I think, to dig into the issues and understand the complexity of things like that. But I also love that speculative fiction lets us craft the kind of worlds we want to see, rather than the world as we see it right now. And so with Lord of the Empty Isles and the tether system, that's something I actively wanted to do as I was figuring out the tether types and connection points and things like that.
I think that's a really great segue also to one of the audience questions we got, which is basically in speculative fiction, how you balance escapism with also experiences readers can connect or identify with. Because I think a lot of people can't necessarily identify with like being in outer space, but also there are cores and there are tropes and there are themes and stuff that are very like universal and also are very relatable. So how do you all balance like the idea of escapism within fantasy and speculative fiction and also kind of tying it to experiences that resonate with people?
I can jump in. I suppose my story is the most realistic. By the way, it's fascinating to listen to Hannah and Jules talk about their books, and I love listening to how people figure out the speculative elements. But for me, it's because no matter how creative or unique the speculative elements are, I think all our stories, and we've heard sort of as all of us have been talking about, they focus on the emotional arc of the characters. So family relationships, for instance, are very important in Sea of Spectres. That's the heart of it. Like, what is this connection between the women across centuries, but also across the generations, and Raina's connection and disconnection? She's estranged from her family when the story begins. And so what her journey is she set off on a journey to try to learn more about her powers of premonition and the phantom ship in a way that will help, maybe not, depending on the decisions that she makes, reconnect herself with her family and her family line, like the matrilineal powers of premonition. And these aspects, whenever I bring in any sort of folklore, and I think there's elements with any sort of speculative that you do, there's elements that somebody at one point in time believed in was fact. And that's what I love. So the phantom ship, the woman in white. So I take these from like their oral history stories of people who lived on Prince Edward Island, and they'll tell you stories of haunted houses, of harbingers of death, as if they were true, because they are true to them. And I think that when you take those things, even if they're separated by decades or even centuries, and take what people believed as fact at one time and put it into mystical of today, but then you talk to someone from today and they believe the same things. Like, so for instance, when I was doing my book launch and I was doing some book events, one of my cousins came up to me, like second cousin once removed or something like that, and said to me, "So how did you know about our matrilineal powers of premonition?" And I went, "What? I made that up." And she said, no, our family has these powers, and talked to me about experiences that she'd had and that other of our relatives have had. And I've always had really strong intuition myself, but I wouldn't call it like mystical. But anyway, I think there's always that escapism is there in the everyday. The magic is in the everyday, whether it's contemporary 2024. I'm sitting in Halifax, Nova Scotia right now, or whether you're on a spaceship or in a desert. That there's always, those elements will always connect to humanity, however humanity is actually conceptualized.
Yeah, to kind of echo Nancy, I think no matter how fantastical your world is, as long as your characters act like people, your reader's going to have no trouble identifying with them. Like, readers are really good at suspending disbelief with like fantastical elements of your world, and like whether those things seem realistic, as long as the way that your characters are acting doesn't feel like it feels like something they can relate to. Like in my book, nobody can probably relate to being a motorcycle courier in a post-apocalyptic world, dodging monsters and storms and raiders every day. But you can relate to a woman who is like working a difficult job to take care of her mother, who she sees, who like she's been parentified. She sees her mother as dependent on her, and she feels a lot of guilt and responsibility about that. So like she compartmentalizes her own emotions and shoves all of her trauma way, way down just so she can get through the day and take care of the people who need her. Like, people understand that no matter what the set dressing is. So yeah, remember that the characters are people. The way that they react to things is not going to be fundamentally different from the way that real human people react to things, even if it's something that we've never encountered.
Definitely. I agree with both Nancy and Hannah that it's almost unavoidable. Like, if you're writing characters, whether they're human specifically or not, no matter what world they're on, if you're writing people interacting with each other, you're going to have that humanity, even if you're escaping into, and I don't think any of our books are necessarily like cozy escapist fantasy or science fiction, but I think if you're writing humans, you're going to have that sense of relatability. In Lord of the Empty Isles specifically, I think even though there are tethers and spaceships and pseudo moons orbiting the planet, I think a lot of people will be able to identify with covering one emotion with the other, because Remy in the book is using his grief and revenge as a cover for the guilt he feels about his brother's death and how he doesn't feel that he was there for his brother at the end, because he was just a boy when he lost his brother. He was 14. And whether it's a matter of grief or not, I think everyone can identify with looking back and regretting something and not necessarily being able to face it in the moment. And one of the amazing things I think about fantasy and science fiction specifically is that while it can be escapist, you can also literally build the world to reflect the struggles your characters are facing. So it's not just that, you can toss in all of these ingredients together. You can tweak them so that they thematically echo what your characters are experiencing. And for Remy specifically, the idea of tethers is that when a tether between a person who is living and one who is dead dies, that tether in Lord of the Empty Isles can start to rot. And so Remy's tether to his brother is, at the point of the book, completely rot bound. And so using the world to reflect the characters, you can escape into fantasy, but you can also build it to echo those emotional human elements. So, yeah.
And that's what I love about speculative fiction, is you can just play with something to the point where you're shining a mirror on our world, on the world as today as we look out our windows, how it can be different, how we can think about things differently. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to reading all sorts of speculative novels.
Yeah, definitely. Same.
Nancy, I want to ask you about how it was to work with not only the multiple timelines, but also the multiple perspectives, how you conceptualized that, how you, I don't know, drew it together, how you created that, and how you developed the common thread that kind of weaves between all of these variety of elements.
A lot of editing and a lot of revisions. They say one of the most difficult things you can do in a debut novel is different time periods and different protagonists. And of course, I didn't know that when I started. And my novel it wouldn't have been the same novel without the different protagonists and the different timelines, because the whole point of the novel is to explore how family talks to each other over the centuries and how ancestors affect descendants, and vice versa, particularly within women's lives. So, but when I had to make a lot of stylistic editing changes, and I talked about one of them, changing Riley to Raina. But one of the things was I had wanted the reader to connect most directly to my historical timeline from 1758, because that's actually what would be most distanced from their own lives. So for that reason, I chose to use that. Madeline, I initially had in first person. I also had her telling her story in a way. I have to be careful what I say here for spoilers, but first person really worked. And then I had the 1864 and then the present day in third person. And I really like writing third person close, because it gets me right into a character's head, but also gives me that little bit of flexibility that I can say things or observe things that the character wouldn't necessarily observe, that I couldn't have done in first person. But obviously I did a lot of research to learn about the context of women's lives in 1758, because as I mentioned before, not a lot was known about Madeline, but I still couldn't get the first person in women in 1758 who also spoke French and was illiterate was a stretch too far, I think, for me to do in first person. And the first person, with the way the stories connected and were told forward, no longer worked for a plot reason. So I switched her into third. So that actually was really helpful for me. That was a really good decision. And then initially I had the characters passing off to each other. So I started with Reina, then I went to Celeste, then Madeline, and I kept doing that because I wanted to forefront the characters talking to each other. And this, but for a variety of reasons, that when we went on submission, that wasn't really sitting with editors, and they would say things like, I really connected to the historical characters, but not the contemporary ones, or vice versa. So then what I had to do was I had to make my historical characters a bit less bleak and my contemporary characters a bit less fun, to make the tone similar. I changed them all into third person, and then I changed the structure so that they were talking, the handoffs from character to character was much more, it seemed organic. Obviously it was constructed by me, the author, but it seemed more organic, whereas something in particular happened in one timeline to connect to the other. And so how I did that was extremely painful, but very helpful. So what I did is I had note cards, and I wrote for each chapter how it began and how it ended, and then what happened next. And I got out highlighters. So I did that for each chapter. And then I got myself a big bag of peanut M&Ms, which were very important to the process. And so what I started doing is I started shuffling these papers so that the timelines had a handoff that would make a lot of sense to the reader. So for instance, there'd be, maybe I finished one chapter with a comment about the Phantom Ship and how that was affecting their lives. So the next one, I would make sure I started with the Phantom Ship. And often it was the folklore that helped me build that through, because that was the through thread along with the family lines. So I learned a lot doing that. It was a lot of fun. And I suppose now when I heard, Jules, when you were talking about being a quilter, I thought, oh, I guess that's what I was doing without knowing at that point in time. I started to quilt things together. So now I'm definitely going to use that term more in my brain as I do editing. Am I going to quilt at this moment? And I will be thinking of you, Jules, as I do that.
It's not my term, though. I picked it up from someone else.
Okay, well, I'll take it, though.
Something that you mentioned earlier, I think was really interesting about like rules you're supposed to do and like rules that you've broken, essentially. And I was wondering from Nancy and Hannah if you also had a similar experience where you also had rules that like someone had said. I know, Nancy, you just talked about how like multiple timelines and multiple perspectives. But yeah, like rules, or Jules, if you have more to share, rules that you knew or like had been told to you, but that you broke, whether or not like intentional choice or also an unintentional choice.
Yeah, I love this question because I love breaking rules. So one of the biggest rules that I was told while writing and querying and going on submission with my first novel, which did not get picked up, by the way. Road to Ruin is not the first novel that I've put out on submission. Don't use flashbacks. Don't use dreams. They, distract from the timeline. They don't push the plot forward. People don't like to read them. I like to read flashbacks and dreams, and more importantly, I like to write them. So I always put them in anyway. And then my agent is like, Hannah, please take these out, edit them out. I'm like, okay, fine, but I get to keep this one in. And through that process of negotiation is how I get to include things I'm not supposed to include in my novels. You just put too much of it in to begin with, and then you can pretend to make compromises and eventually get to keep what you want. So I got to keep one flashback and one dream in my novel. I will not tell you how many were in there to begin with. But I'm super happy about the ones that stayed in. It's the flashback is a story that my main character tells about her father from her father's perspective. So it's also like a little bit of an alternate POV in there. And the dream is one that she has about a character from her past, her ex-girlfriend. And that was my way of like, with the story about her father, it's explaining more about the world and also giving a lot of insight into why Jin is the way that she is. And with the dream, it's a way of introducing the relationship between her and her ex, who is an important character in the novel, but at that point they haven't crossed paths yet. Yeah, and if I hadn't broken rules, then I would have had to find some other much more boring way to do those things.
For me, I guess it goes back to the craft bit about revising. The first chapter is how I figure out the tone of the novel, the character of novel. Now, before that, I mean, I have my notes of character development and research and all that sort of stuff. But as I'm writing, I can't continue until I get the character's voice. So I will rewrite the first chapter. I don't know how many times before I even move to chapter 2, because if I know if I move to chapter 2 before I nail the voice, I'm just wasting my time, because the voice also changes the character development every time as I'm doing writing. So I think the rules for how you write, there aren't any rules. Like, you should do whatever works for you. And once you find out what works, don't let anyone tell you you shouldn't do it that way. If it works, just keep doing it. And the way I figured out that it worked for me was just trial and error.
Carrying on from what Nancy said, I think a lot of the guidelines, the rules for writing they're made because they worked for a large number of people. And so now people assume that they work for everyone, and they're stating them as if everybody absolutely must follow them. But I think part of being a writer is discovering your own process, discovering what works best for you. And so breaking, it's, don't, like, some people, if they stop writing, they lose that forward momentum, and they can't bring themselves to go back to the story. But I mean, if you can, every time I write a chapter or write a scene, I will take notes about it, and I'll be like, I'm not sure if X is working. Is this scene between these characters, is it actually doing what I want it to? Like, I need it to be intense. I need readers to be involved here. Come back again, look at this in the future, kind of work on it more. And so part of getting myself to continue writing, because I try to fast draft, because drafting is an absolutely miserable experience for me. I doubt myself, and once I reach the 50% point, it's out. Like, I'm just like, this is horrible. I hate this. I am never going to complete this book. And so I've got a fast draft to get there. But I also want to make sure that I'm getting it as true as it can be to what I hope the end product will be. And so I revise while I write, and I reread previous scenes so that I can get the tone down before I move into what I'll be writing next. And so do whatever works for you. Like, if there's a rule that you think you need to break, then break it.
Okay. I want to ask Hannah, have you seen Furiosa? And if you have, what are your thoughts? I guess if anyone has seen Furiosa,
Yeah,
what are your thoughts?
Of course, I've seen Furiosa. I went and saw it opening weekend, and then I went and saw it again with a different group of people. I didn't see it 3 times. I saw Mad Max Fury Road in theaters 3 times, but like, by the time Furiosa came out, like, the theater going experience as a whole is just less appealing to me these days. But I'm definitely going to watch it, like, when it comes out on streaming, if it's not already out on streaming. I don't know. I don't pay attention to these things, but I did really enjoy it. It's definitely a very different movie from Mad Max Fury Road. It's a lot more talky and plotty, and there's more things going on, and it's less like vibes, cars driving across the wasteland, people killing each other. There's still plenty of that, and I do enjoy those scenes. But I like the way that they kind of matured the series and started telling a bigger story that feels more like a grand mythology than Mad Max Fury Road, which felt like a very focused story on a single person and the people in his orbit. That was a very cool change, and I really like the addition of more dialogue into the film. I thought that some of the speeches were very powerful, like the scenes towards the end where, like, the main themes of the movie kind of come out in these grand speeches that the villain is making. I always love stuff like that. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. It doesn't knock Mad Max Fury Road out of the top spot for my favorite movie, but it was still really good.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet because I was avoiding like movie theaters in general, but that's why I wanted to know. I wanted to know how it held up to see if it was worth like potentially paying to stream it or something, if that's even available at the moment. The last question I want to ask.
So.
Yeah. The last question I want to ask you all is how it has been to work on books two. I know not books two and like the amount of books you've ever written in your life, but like book two project after your debut, whether that be sequels, whether that be whatever project is next. How has it been to work on book two? And I'd love to start with Hannah and the sequel to Road to Ruin, which I'm very personally excited for.
Yeah, people are not lying when they talk about sophomore slump and book two of your contract being super difficult to write. It definitely was for me. Like, I knew that the process of writing a book is never the same two times. Like, I'd already written another book before, so I thought, okay, it'll be different, but it's still just a book. I've written a couple of those now. How hard could it be? It's really hard. Writing some books doesn't make writing more books easier, unfortunately, especially when it's a sequel. I was so excited to write a sequel because, like, every writer who's querying and trying to get a book published knows that it's really hard to get the opportunity to write a sequel. Like, standalones are a lower risk for a publisher. Publishers are buying more of them now, even in science fiction and fantasy, which is a genre that's previously been dominated by like long series. It's all different nowadays. Like, debut authors rarely get the chance to write more than one. So I was super psyched to write a direct sequel to my book. And it also really needed one because it kind of ends on a cliffhanger. But then actually writing that sequel turned out to be very challenging. Another thing that made it more difficult was that I didn't know for sure how many books were going to be in the series. My publisher bought two. I was thinking, well, I think I would like to write a trilogy. So when I'm writing book two, I'm going to leave it open-ended and see how my publisher feels about picking up a book three. Spoiler alert, they did not feel good about picking up a book three. So then I had to go back to my sequel and rewrite it to wrap up the duology. Which was another huge challenge, but I'm happy with how it turned out. I'm happy with like the place where the series is at the end of book two. And I know that like further down the line, you never know what happens in publishing. I might get the chance to go back and write more books in that story, in that world. You never know. You have to stay on your toes.
Yeah, I wrote A Sea of Spectres as a standalone, and it was a one book deal. So while that was going through, I started working on a few different other projects. But as I was going through with my editor for A Sea of Spectres, she kept asking me for a sequel. She says, I want one more, I want two more, I want a whole series. When are you going to start writing them? And all I could think was, I don't have an idea for anything else in the series. I wrote it as a standalone. And I think authors might often have sort of that in their head. How can they pick things up? But I just didn't have an idea for it. So I was working on other things. And then in about June, just as I was launching with The Sea of Spectres, I got the idea for the sequel. And this character, one of the characters, and so it's same world, different protagonists. So I'm sticking with the same families, but different people in them. So like the intergenerational, I'm going from the parents to the children who are a variety of ages. And the idea came to me as to how to do it. So I went and I mapped it all out. But one of the things about mapping second and third novels, when you've already written the first is done. There's no changing it. So a few times I thought, oh, if I'd only done this, or if I'd only done that. But in the end, I'm wondering if this was better because I couldn't go mess with anything. Like, this is your scaffold, and you make that work. And so I did make it work, like on my blurb and my synopsis, obviously. So I'm going through with my publisher about the possibility of doing the second and third. And I'm actually really excited about it because the main character started to talk to me in her head, and she's in my head, her head, my head. And she's already given me her first line. But I also know it's not going to be easy. I had a coffee with a cousin today, and she said, so the next books you write, now that you know what you're doing, it's going to be really easy, right? And I laughed, kind of like Hannah said. I said, people have written 11, 19 books, and they're still saying, how do I do this again? And I think it's because the creative process is so darn creative, and that blank page can take you anywhere, which is a lot of fun, but sometimes that's the most difficult part as well. So I love being in the same world. That's going to give me a great place to start with.
Definitely. I have an absolutely ridiculous amount of respect for both Hannah and Nancy, like writing series, writing more than one book in the same universe. Like that takes a lot. So I have an incredible amount of respect. I definitely wrote Lord of the Empty Isles as like a standalone because I do not yet have the confidence to tackle like a duology or trilogy or series. My agent asked like, "Hey, what if there was another book?" And I was like, "Haha, no." So, because like, I mean, ultimately, this is the story of a character's journey. Like, there is room, I think, in the world itself, like in the universe, for more to happen, but the story itself is closed. Like, the character has taken the journey they need to take, and this is over. But my book 2, I would like to say that the sophomore slump applies even if you have already written your second book, because I sold Lord of the Empty Isles in a 2-book deal. And when I put forward a few different projects for book 2, and my editor read them. One was out of the running because it was YA-ish, and the contract stipulated adult. And so the 2 remaining, my editor liked both of them, was like, okay, you get to choose. And so naturally I chose the one that I had already completed writing, because I did not want to write a second book on contract. I have heard how torturous that can be. And so I chose the book I had already written, which was the weird science fantasy, which has since lost its science, or most of its science. It's like mostly fantasy now. But it was I got into Pitch Wars 2020 with it. And then when I queried it, it was definitely not the time. I was querying in 2020 and 2021. And it was not a great time for that book. It had some close calls, but it did not end up finding an agent. But I still really loved it. And so I kind of pushed it as book 2. I was like, this one, please, this one. But editing it was a lot. And so, yeah. But luckily, choosing that book as book 2 gave me time to work on the other concept I had pitched and actually complete it. So now I'll be able to submit that one as an option proposal, hopefully. So that's kind of the goal with that. There is, I think, some worry that comes along with having your second book being the previous book that was written, which is like, oh, what if it's worse? It's like, maybe some people liked my first book, but now I have the opportunity to disappoint them. So, so that's always an interesting feeling.
Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, we're gonna end this on like such an optimistic note. Everyone's so excited. So yeah, just and I'm excited for book 2 in general anyway. But yeah, it is interesting though, because I feel like when you ask this question, especially in the debut panels, the journey for second books are all so different. And kind of what Jules was saying, right? Like sometimes the book that even is the debut is not even the one that was sold first. And then like, timing and publishing and everything just kind of go off the rails at some points. And so it is really interesting to hear about like how everyone's journey is a little bit different in terms of what options are available from the beginning and sort of like then afterwards, and then the timing of when you write things and when they get picked up, and whether that be a project from like years ago or a project from like that's kind of just ideating at the moment. But I just want to thank everyone so much for joining me. Thank you to everyone in the chat who was watching the panel and also submitted questions. Thank you to all of the authors who are chatting with us today. Everybody's book link is down below, so you can definitely pick them up since we've all piqued your interest about all of these books that we've been chatting about today. And yeah, I would love to just thank everyone again for coming, and I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Lily.
Yeah, thank